Welcome to this Spotlight Talk on the Balch Hearth. Our Spotlight Talks are 15 to 25-minute talks on a specific object or group of objects in our collection or on historical topics. Today I'm going to talk about the Balch Hearth. We actually have two very different fireplaces in the Balch house as seen here. Today I will only talk about the one in the oldest part of the house, in the room we call the Great Room. If you have seen our Hailheart Spotlight Talk, you will already realize that our Balch Hearth in the Great Room is very different from the Hailheart at the Hale House. The Hailheart was built in the mid to late 1800s to become more of what we consider a modern fireplace. By the late 1800s, it was no longer being used as a kitchen hearth, but as a parlor hearth. It has a metal bar as a swing-out arm on which pots were placed. The Balch Hearth in the Great Room is the main one and is quite typical of fireplaces they used in the 1600s. It is a bit over 4 feet high, about 6 feet wide, and just under 3 feet deep. A hearth like this was not very efficient in heating a room or in sending smoke up a chimney. Because it was so open, the smoke would just kind of fill up the fireplace and then pool out into the room rather than going up the chimney. So rooms were very smoky. As for heating a room or the house, only the area immediately in front of the fireplace was warm. A typical house of the time would use about 20 cords of wood a year. A cord of wood is about 8 feet wide, 4 feet deep, and about 4 feet tall. Now, before I began working here at Historic Beverly, whenever I saw a fireplace like this one, I always thought of a huge roaring fire built in there. Through my research, I've come to learn that actually they usually built a small fire, usually centrally located. Sometimes they may have had 2 or even 3 small fires spread around the fireplace. With a small fire, when they were to start cooking, they'd pull out a small batch of coals out onto the hearth and make a burner for the pan, trivet, or gridiron. I know I sometimes wish I could make my own burners for however many I needed, especially when I was making a big meal for my family or friends. Now, when you were finished cooking, you would simply take the pan off the coals, then you would use that long-handled shovel to scoop up and put the coals back into the fire. Then you would sweep the ashes off the hearth with a broom, much like this one. Voila, a clean hearth. As you can imagine, having to work around fire while wearing long skirts was not exactly a very safe proposition. Girls and women learned very early to be cautious with their skirts when they were around the fire. A moment's distraction or inattention could still occasionally result in accidents where women or young girls' skirts would be caught on fire. These women or girls were sometimes severely burned or even died from their injuries just trying to make a family a meal. Looking up at the chimney in the center picture, you can see that instead of a swing-out arm like the Hailheart has, the Balch Hearth has a stationary bar mounted high inside the chimney called a lug pole. The bracket and arrow show you where the lug pole can be seen. For perspective, the back of the hearth is on the bottom, and the front of the hearth with the wood trim is on the top. You can see some slender metal bars with holes that are hung from the lug pole. In the picture on the left, you can see a close-up of those metal bars with holes. They are called trammels. Trammels can be moved along the bar to where it was needed. Hooks, like the one in the picture on the right, could be raised or lowered to different heights on the trammel, depending upon how close or how far from the fire it was needed. Pots could then be placed on the hooks for cooking or just kept warm. In the early days, the colonists would use a wooden pole made of green or freshly cut wood so it would last longer. If they didn't watch closely and change it regularly, it could suddenly be burnt through and anything on the pole would come crashing down on the fire. That is when some of those ladies had their skirts caught on fire, when they were caught unaware and the lug pole was burnt through. Once there was a blacksmith available and they could afford to, most colonists would put in an iron lug pole. Several tools would have been available to help with the fire and cooking. One of them are these tongs on the left. This tool would have been used to place logs on the fire or to move them or to adjust their places on the fire. The shovel on the right is typical of a tool that would have been used to pull coals from the fire to make those burners I mentioned earlier. There would also likely have been a bellows to encourage embers to burn and a poker to move around logs as well as to help break apart sections of wood to increase your flames. If you had a pan without feet, then you would use either the gridiron or the trivet. They would have been placed over hot coals on the hearth. Any pot or pan could be placed on the gridiron and be very stable. Note the large open center of the trivet. A pot with sloping sides or curved ones could be placed inside the center, and that would suspend it over the coals that had been placed underneath. Some of the most common pans in use are seen here and in the next pictures. After they pulled out the coals to make a burner, they would take a small pan like the pan with little legs on the top picture and place them over the coals to do their cooking. This pan type had a flat bottom and straight, shallow sides. This flat bottom skillet had a short handle and 3 short legs on which they also sat over the coals, so you could brown your meat or cook whatever you were cooking. It was often called a spider pan. In the bottom picture, on the right, you can see a deep pan with slightly rounded bottom, which stands on 3 legs and a handle. They varied from 6 inches to 12 inches wide. In the early days, they were called posnets or pipkins and were used for cooking in the embers. These posnets or pipkins were more akin to what we today would call a sauce pot or saucepan. A pot had bulging sides like this, like the one on the left, and usually had a cover. On the right is a kettle. It was distinguished from a pot by its sloping sides and with no cover of its own. Although we do not have one at Balch, colonists also often had fry pans made of iron with 3-foot-long handles. There was a hole in the tip of the handle so they could be hung up when not in use. The short-handled frying pan like we use today came into being when stoves began to be more commonly used. Seen here is a Dutch oven. The Dutch oven is a familiar piece of equipment even to us today. However, the one we have at Balch House is different from what we normally see today. Just like the skillet, it has 4 little legs where it would be placed over the coals. It also has a lid on it that is not a domed lid like we typically see today. Instead, it is a flat lid because they would create a burner with the coals on the hearth. Then they would place the Dutch oven with whatever they were cooking over those coals. They put the lid on it and then place more coals on top of the lid. This way, they'd be cooking from both the top and the bottom, and that is how it was used as an oven. Here on the left, we have a teapot hanging from a trammel and hook. It probably would have been always kept over the fire with water in it for tea or for hot water for cooking. On the right, we have a small kettle that is also hung on a trammel and hook. Odds and ends of vegetables, including peelings, as well as meat bones, fat, and gristle, would have been thrown into a pot or kettle like this, and the contents would have been kept covered with water. Simmered for a long time, the water, vegetables, meat bones, fat, and gristle would make a nourishing stock from which to make soups or stews, which were then used, which were the usual fare for most meals, or a nourishing broth for someone who is ill or worn down. Other than the pots and pans with feet, which we still use when camping today, most of the cooking tools in the colonial kitchens were similar to what we use in our kitchens today. They included a fork like this one on the left that would have been used to stir or turn over meat or vegetables while cooking in the skillets. Over here on the right, there's a copper ladle, which would have been used to dip water or to scoop out some of that nourishing broth into or out of a pot to make a soup or stew. In the center is this unusual tool, which is not in regular use in most kitchens today. We believe this is a tool that was called a flip dog. This was a long iron used to heat a drink like a flip or a toddy. The end was heated in the embers until red hot, then plunged into the drink, which sizzled. It probably reacted with the sugar and the alcohol, giving a sort of caramelized taste. Now ours is only about 18 inches long, but usually a flip dog was about 2 to 3 feet long with either a tear-shaped or pointed end. It was hung right by the hearth and was used quite a bit to heat drinks such as hot toddies. If you have watched our Hailheart Spotlight talk, then you will have seen this piece of cooking equipment before. It's a clockwork oven. These came into more general use in the early 1700s. It is made of metal, and the interior would have been kept clean and polished to a shine to reflect heat from the fire. It may remind you of a rotisserie as we see today. A clockwork oven like this would have been used to roast meat or even bake biscuits. Once the food was placed in the oven, it would have been placed in front of the fire, facing the fire. Why is it called a clockwork oven? Look closely at the center picture. There are little holes on one end, so they would pull the end of the spit out of one hole, turn the spit slightly, and then re-engage the spit in the next hole. This rotation was done to help the meat roast more evenly. You would place the meat on the spit with a pan placed underneath to catch the drippings. The drippings could be used to make gravy or Yorkshire pudding, a savory pudding baked in beef drippings. Unused drippings would have been put back in that broth pot that I mentioned earlier. As you can see in the picture on the right, at the back of the clockwork oven, there is a small door that would have been opened to check on the meat and baste it, then closed to preserve heat. If you were baking biscuits, you could just place the pan of biscuits in the oven, or you could put coals in the bottom of the oven with a grate over them and put the biscuit pan on top of that grate. Either way, after the biscuits were in the oven, you would place the oven facing the fire. Around the fireplace and hanging around the room, you will see some drying herbs as well as some fresh herbs. This was typical of colonial homes. Nearly every household had an herb garden near the kitchen. The center picture shows the one we have at Balch House. During colonial times, herbs had many purposes. They were used as seasonings, much as we use them today. They were also used frequently as medicine. There were generally no doctors or pharmacies. Families would make their own medicines and remedies with teas, salves, and other methods. Some, such as mint, would be used to keep bugs away. Even today, mint is often used as a bug repellent, and they may also have been used to keep the air fresher. Now let's elaborate on a couple of those purposes. Medicinal. From the earliest days of humanity through today, herbal cures have been used. Even today, a few of our modern prescription medicines have herbs or extracts from herbs as part of the ingredients, and many herbs are being tested and examined for further prescription use. There were few doctors like we have today, especially here in the colonies. So colonists had to find and make their own treatments for any illnesses, injuries, or pain that they might have had. To learn more about some of those home remedies, you can watch for our spiderweb, dragon oil, and borax talk on our YouTube channel. In addition to being used for medicine and for seasoning like we do today, as I mentioned earlier, the fireplace is quite large. And because it was so tall and deep and wide, the smoke didn't draw out very efficiently through the chimney. Instead, it would fill up the fireplace and end up puddling out into the rooms, making them very smoky. So the fresh herbs would have also been used to help keep the air just a little bit fresher. So, after all this talk about how they used the hearth for cooking, what did they actually cook and eat? For breakfast, it was usually just some bread dipped in milk. If they were lucky, they had porridge, cornmeal porridge mostly, especially in the earliest colonial days. Once they were here for a while, and the crops were well established, they may have had oats for oatmeal. For dinner, the biggest meal of the day, that was usually eaten midday. For dinner, it would have been soups or stews, boiled meats, and vegetables. When the day's chores and tasks were done, the evening meal would have simply been the leftovers from dinner. Skillet cornbread would have been made and eaten regularly in New England and much of the other parts of the colonies because corn was widely available, and once dried, it lasted a long time and could be ground as needed into cornmeal, or what Native Americans called samp. In the earliest days here in the American colonies, they didn't have ovens, not even the clockwork ovens, so they didn't bake or eat as much bread as we know it. Only quick breads like biscuits, cornbread, or hoe cakes that could be cooked in a skillet or on a flat piece of metal called a hoe that was placed over the coals. On our website, www.historicbeverly.net, you can search our online collection or buy items from our shop. You can also find a link to our YouTube channel where we have over 120 hours of video available, and we're adding more every month. If you subscribe to our YouTube channel, you will know whenever we add a new video. Unless noted on this slide, all images were either from our Historic Beverly collections or in our Historic Beverly files. Other images were labeled for public domain reuse online, and those sources are listed here. This concludes today's Spotlight Talk on Balch Hearth cooking. Are there any questions? If you have any, you can reach out to us at research@historicbeverly.net and send them to us, and we will respond to you as quickly as we can. Please remember to support future programming like this by texting to give to this number. If not already, you can also become a member of Historic Beverly and get our printed newsletter twice a year and our twice-monthly emails about upcoming events and brief topics discussed. To find out more about our upcoming programs, check out our website at historicbeverly.net. You can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Just look for Historic Beverly. Thank you for watching the Spotlight Talk. We hope to see you at one of our upcoming programs. Bye.